Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sally, and on behalf of Harvard Book Store, Books and Books, Seminary Book Co-op, and Elliott Bay Book Company, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Pankaj Mishra presenting his new book, Run and Hide. He will be joined in conversation tonight by Yiyun Li. Thank you for joining us virtually this evening. Harvard Book Store's virtual event series continues this winter, bringing authors and their works to our community and our digital community. Find our events schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can disable your captions there as well. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase Run and Hide on harvard.com and this event's partner bookstores. Your purchases truly make events like tonight's possible and help the future of independent bookstores. Thank you all for tuning in, and we sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Pankaj Mishra is the author of The Romantics, which won the Art Seidenbaum Award, Bland Fanatics, Age of Anger, and From the Ruins of Empire. He contributes political and literary essays to The Guardian, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and the New Yorker. Joining him this evening is fellow author Yiyun Li. She teaches at Princeton University and is the author of 8 books, including her novel, Where Reasons End. Her newest book, The Book of Goose, will be published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in September. They'll be discussing Pankaj's newest book, Run and Hide, the story of a student fighting for his place in the world amid a changing country and global order, and the inequalities of class and gender that map onto our most intimate relationships. Kirkus, in a starred review, called it an intense, probing novel, astute and discomfiting. We are so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. The digital podium is yours, Pankaj and Yiyun.
Thank you, Sally.
Thank you, Sally.
Hello, good evening. I think, let me just, thank you. Hi, Pankaj, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Lee.
It's late in London, I suppose, yes.
It is, it's not too late, actually.
Yeah.
It's 11 o'clock.
Yes. So I thought, we would start, I'm just going to show the copy of my book, the cover of my book, and I have read the book with all these stickers. I find it a very moving novel and thought-provoking, and I wonder if I can just ask you to give a sense of what the novel is to the readers, or to the readers who haven't read it, and in your own words, just a brief introduction.
Sure. Thank you. I think I'll read a little bit from the book just to sort of, give a sense of, especially the early chapters, which describe these 3 students at the Indian Institute of Technology, which is, one of the institutions that many Indians aspire to get into, because if you do manage to get into it, then you're guaranteed a life of prosperity, basically everything that your parents and their parents and your several generations have been aspiring for. And so it's a very highly competitive exams to get into it, and people spend many years of their childhood preparing for the entrance exams. So essentially, a lot of Indians I knew did not have a childhood because they were so busy preparing for these entrance exams. And the opening chapters, the book essentially traces the journeys of these 3 students over 3 decades after they pass out of IIT and enter the wider world, end up in very senior positions in the world of finance and media. And the book is narrated by one of the 3 friends who actually does not enter this very busy world and stays on the margins, observes it from the margins until he too is drawn into this larger world. And so it's the narrator who describes in these early pages returning to his small town, and these are all three students are all from very modest backgrounds from small towns across India, and he's describing his journey back home from these coaching classes that he attends for the entrance exams to the IIT. For 2 years before I got into IIT and left my childhood home for good, I attended coaching classes in Delhi. Like Asim and Virendra, I always returned home with a growing dread of what I would find there. How agonizingly vivid are those scenes from the 1980s in which I find some clues to our later conduct. The train from Old Delhi station, obstinately fuming and grinding across the plains of Punjab and Haryana, reaches Devli at about 5 in the morning. Narrow, roofless platforms hurtle past the windows of my second-class unreserved carriage all night, the wind through the bars blowing coal dust in my hair. When the train stops, I see a dimly lit station platform where coolies prowl, always in twos, ready to rush the rear alighting passenger, ready to roll their scarves into a circular pad on their head and receive a metal trunk on this impromptu cushion. From somewhere comes the clatter of an iron cart and the clank clank and dong dong of a hammer testing wheels. Shadowy people pass the window, never to be seen again. One of them turns halfway around, but only to squirt a tremendous spit of pan juice onto the floor. Then with several hisses, the coach lurches off, passing the signalman holding up a lantern, his face fiendish in the trembling green glow. The train rocks gently as it switches tracks, the few lights thin, and the extensive night outside my window resumes its course. I sit on a straight-backed wooden bench, wedged in between several people and facing a similarly tense row on the opposite side, with sinking heads jerking up and then again starting to slowly sink. In the bunk above me, the faint yellowish light of the lamps exposes a jumble of half-slumbering bodies. Sometimes I doze off, but the train whistles with piercing melancholy, stutters over a level crossing, roars into a loud tunnel, the metal window shutter starts clattering in its frame, or the man next to me, sitting hunched over, his big, strong nose snoring softly and giving off a thick smell of sweat, suddenly slumps onto my lap. My whole body goes tense. I want so badly to stretch my legs and put my feet up on something. And in that state of immobility, I become convinced that happiness will always be beyond my reach. Devli has no railway yard worth speaking of, only a few condemned carriages and wagons and locomotives of crumpled iron on a couple of sidings. There is one platform with a small roof under which stands a stone building painted with stripes of white and brown. It accommodates the station master's office and a stall from which my father sells tea, samosas, sliced white bread, biscuits, hard-boiled eggs, pan, and cigarettes. At daybreak, men and women are sleeping everywhere on the pan-stained floor, draped head to toe in white, the white always shocking, the color of death and mourning under urgently spinning low fans. Imagine me alighting into this haven for the destitute, walking through the anonymous white bundles, past the dogs that are beginning to wake and mourn, through a muddy forecourt of two-wheel tongas, cycle rickshaws, and bullock carts, and an open refuse heap, which stray cows timidly pillage, shifting a hoof now and then, their skin twitching. In a narrow dirt lane stands the barracks for railway workers, their walls plastered with drying cow dung cakes, and broken furniture spilled across the small yards before every room. Underneath, clotheslines laden with washing, scrawny chickens scratch the earth, and only the occasional row of tulsi in old dalda tins speak of a feeling for order and the vanity of ownership. At this time in the morning, cooking fires from angitis rise in fine columns to the blue sky. In our own little yard, a cow stands nibbling under a rough lean-to roofed with thatch. She's tightly leashed to an iron stake so that she can't reach either a small cabbage and tomato patch or the black pot over the brazier in which my mother cooks every morning and afternoon, squatting on the tiny veranda made by the overhang of the roof, the anchal of her sari spilling over into the ground.
Thank you for that reading. You know, I must tell you, when I was reading that, I was on the train from Princeton to New York. And there was something about just going back to 1980s, you know, as I told you, this also brought a lot of my memories of 1980s China back to me. And I thought one thing that novel is so beautiful is to capture or recapture the texture of life, you know, from the past, and texture of home, you know, and all these memories coming back. And I want to just ask you a couple questions about home and homecoming and leave taking, because, you know, one of the themes that I thought the novel deals with is, you know, when you come from a small town, when you come from a countryside, or when you come from, you know, China or India, one of the biggest thing in your life is you're going to leave home. That home is never permanent, it's temporary. And so home, the leave taking, it seems to be a theme of many people's shared experience. And with home, you know, with leave taking, of course, is homecoming, but never homecoming is it, you know, permanent either. So I want to hear you talk about the two themes of leave taking and homecoming in the context of the novel.
Well, that's so, I mean, that's really so bracing to hear that, because I feel like when we talk about novels, we don't really talk about the ways in which this experience is very specific to certain societies. And, you know, actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking, in contemporary fiction, it's only really Irish fiction where this sort of, you know, theme is very present, because again, you have this trajectory of people leaving home and often leaving home to go away to some other country to work. And that's been really kind of, you know, the dominant theme for at least the last century or so. And in India and China, as you rightly point out, most children are on this particular trajectory where they're going to get educated and at some point leave the past behind, leave their homes behind. And I think it's more than that. There is this, obviously, the physical dislocation, but there's also, I think there's a kind of emotional betrayal that you also have to engage in, which is that what you're leaving behind is something that has to be necessarily overcome if you want to become a successful person, if you want to become, let's say, modern in the sort of Indian sense of the word. You have to leave your parents behind. You have to leave this life which is stigmatized by not only its poverty, but also its cultural backwardness. Mm-hmm. And so you make this journey away from home, and you basically also embrace, essentially, or you actually rush to embrace a kind of betrayal, because you have to get away from it in order to, you know, really be something in the wider world. And so home coming and leave taking in particular is a very fraught, because it's just not physical location, it's also emotional disconnection. And homecoming is fraught because when you do return, if you manage to return at all, the landmarks of the past that orientated you have all disappeared. They're all gone. So even the physical landmarks have gone, because those places themselves have been, to use the jargon word again, modernized. So the alleys, the houses that you were accustomed to, that you first rested your eyes on, the places that again orientated you to the wider world, in which you first, you know, started to notice things, in which you started to learn things, in which you first met people, they've all gone. They've all gone. So it's not just the people who've disappeared or moved away elsewhere. So I think the whole experience really amounts to massive, massive uprootedness. And this is something I've been kind of obsessed with, even in my nonfiction, is that are human beings capable of dealing with such profound uprootedness and disorientation? And especially on this kind of scale and this kind of speed, the kind of speed of change that you see in places like India and China, it's truly unprecedented. The journeys so many of us have made in just 20 or 30 years, most Europeans and Americans took much longer, and 2 or 3 generations went through these journeys that many of us have undertaken in just 20 years or so. So I mean, again, I think this is really a question that goes to the heart of what I'm trying to do with this novel, and also with other things that I've written, kind of describe this experience of profound dislocation and confusion. And again, the sort of this massive change and the feelings of confusion and self-betrayal that it gives rise to.
Right. And, I want to follow up a question about that big wide world out there, I want to, because you also quoted V.S. Naipaul's a band in the river. But I also wrote about the exact quote that you quoted in your book. And so I'm going to read it out. The world is what it is. Men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it. So this is the Naipaul's opens a bend in the river. And your character often quoted that book and talks about that book. And I want to ask you a question about this world is what it is, but we have to make the place for ourselves. That pressure of not only leaving home, but also, making something out of nothing. And with your characters, the 3 friends, one goes all the way to Wall Street and, Hampton and having all these fancy parties like Great Gatsby, before his fall. And then one is a media, guru in India, and one is a writer. But there's always this pressure of, if you don't make a place for yourself, you're becoming nothing. That kind of pressure. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I do think that, is something, people from China, people from India face, but also, I think to a smaller scale, also people in the West, they also face that you have to claim something, that kind of urge. Where does that lead us? Where does that lead this this generation or next generation? Can you talk a little about that?
Yes, thank you again, because I think this particular sentiment that the world, the way I'm sort of interpreting it, which is that the world with all its injustices is what you have to live in. And the politics that we've engaged in all this time, whether it's India or China becoming free or sovereign nations, that's not really going to help you because you're an individual out there completely exposed to this world. There are no buffers really. So you have to make a place for yourself in this world, or you'll be nothing. So it's a very bleak, in that sense, it's a very bleak formulation. It offers no hope whatsoever. It's just saying, and that's why I also thought it's a perfect description, let's say, for our age of individualism, which is also the age of economic globalization, so that we're all released in that sense from, these kind of nations where for at least 3 or 4 decades, there was this idea that we're all collectively advancing. And then suddenly in the 1980s and 90s, there is this idea that we're all individually striving to get ahead of everyone else. So this is the big shift. I think you see that in obviously in India and China. And I should also say, a large part of the inspiration for this book came from watching Chinese films and also, reading Chinese authors. both, like yourself, who now live in America, also Chinese writers who live in China, just sort of getting a sense of just what this change has amounted to, like moving from essentially collectivist societies to societies that have embraced this degree of individualism, where you simply assume that you're going to be nothing if you don't strive and make a place for yourself, and then for your family and your friends in this world. For the generation that I'm describing, this was really, I suppose, this was the only belief system they had internalized. They were not particularly religious. They were not particularly spiritual. All they knew was that they had to strive, they had to work very hard, and really kind of, fight hard to find that place for themselves. Now, what happens after that, nobody knew.
Right.
And so that was the big deception, that you're fighting this hard, you're sacrificing your childhood, you're betraying your parents, you turn your back on your family, you turn your back on your past, because you think it doesn't quite fit in this new image you have of yourself in this wider world. And then you arrive in the wider world, and your experience is that of deep disappointment and disillusionment and disorientation, because you've systematically deprived yourself of all the ways in which most people over centuries and centuries of human history have found themselves in the world, through their families, through their parents, through their past. So you are floating in this very large world, armed only with this sort of very bleak notion that if you don't do it, someone else will take that place or push you aside. But it's extraordinary that that kind of sentiment became really the sort of dominant sentiment for tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people, and still is probably the only philosophy that most people espouse. And you find like a big author who's very famous in India is Ayn Rand, again that kind of ruthless individualism, which Naipaul sums up with this particular formulation, but it's exactly the individual against the world.
Right. And yet I like what you said, it used to be we advance together, there was that either a belief or disillusion or illusion of you belong somewhere, you belong to this group of people, you belong to this community. And I want to ask you about belonging and unbelonging, because, one of the friends made all the way to New York and, became a billionaire. And yet, did he belong to, to the wealthy class in America? Or is that belonging also just an illusion for him? And another friend became, a media center, the center of the media. It seems like he doesn't belong anywhere, but he has made a group around him just through power and manipulation. And, where does that belong, the sense of belonging? Or maybe belonging is just it's not a real sense.
Yeah, it is. I feel like, in a way, we are all embarked on very radical adventures of the kind that our, ancestors or parents or grandparents and their grandparents couldn't have even dreamed of, which is to, again, sort of live without all the traditional constellations, whether it's of religion or, tradition or philosophy or family, is to live freely without any rules whatsoever. And, this one of the friends who comes from a low caste family and then goes to IIT and moves to New York and becomes a big figure in the financial world. This person really cannot belong to, the community that he finds himself in the United States. He might buy up any number of properties on Long Island, or indeed in Europe, but he will always be haunted by feelings of inadequacy, the sense of shame that he carries deep within himself, which comes from belonging to a low caste, belonging to an illiterate family, all kinds of things that haunt you deep into old age. And no matter how materially successful you are, these kinds of emotional injuries that are inflicted on you early in your life, those don't heal, and you're constantly scratching the wounds inflicted by those early injuries. The guy who becomes a media tycoon, he thinks that accumulating a certain kind of personal power, often expressed through sexual promiscuity or sexual charisma, is going to be the answer. And he too, obviously, flounders. He has far too many political enemies in the end, and in the end, he makes a terrible mistake. But again, there is this sort of striving for something that will give your life meaning of some kind, hold it down somewhere. And I think both of them, fail in different ways. But this is again a sort of experience that I really wanted to grapple with, something I could not do in my nonfiction. To sort of look more closely at what exactly were these people running away from, and where did they arrive in the end.
Right. I want to follow up with the nonfiction, but I want to also ask about the narrator. By the way, I just quickly showed the book cover to the audience. And the third friend, which is our narrator, we haven't talked about his journey. So he did not become a go-getter. He did not go to the wider world. He went the other direction. He went to Himalayas. He lived in the Himalayas for many years and became a translator and seriously doing his work. Can you talk a little bit about him? I'm fascinated by him, his life choice, for instance, and he's looking for meaning and purpose and solution. Right? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Yes, I mean, I thought of him as a narrator because I felt I needed a narrator who is not deeply immersed in this world that he's supposed to enter, or he's expected to enter, that he keeps his distance from it, and someone maybe who's just too damaged really to fully inhabit this world of glamour and prosperity, that he's been marked at an early age, as many people are, by certain experiences, and also certain sort of other experiences which he has, which is of nature, of being interested in literature, of not wanting to get into finance, maybe doing something else. And I have met people like that who kind of go to these institutions and they decide that this life of money making is not for them, so they will do something else. So I wanted a narrator of that kind, but also someone who doesn't simply judge the friends that he grows up with, and he's himself at some point in this corruption that he's describing, and feels again haunted by feelings of betrayal, especially in his relationship with his mother. Mm-hmm. So I thought of this narrator as someone who's on the margins, who does literary work, but again as a translator. And I've often thought of translators as very interesting people who always are somehow invisible, but are indispensable at the same time. And without them, so much of literature would be simply inaccessible to us. And yet we don't really think, much about them. We don't really know much about them, the ways in which they mediate between cultures and so on. So I thought, well, let's have a translator as a narrator. So he can also, talk about literature, about the role of writers, and there's a lot of that in the novel too, because that's something I'm also interested in. Like, what role do writers play in this wider world? What role does writing itself play? So for that reason too, I wanted the narrator to be a translator.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I'm just curious, how much do you see yourself in this narrator? Because there's some overlap.
There's some superficial resemblances. I think, I gave to him my fascination with the Himalayas and with mountains in general, and my interest in just going on long treks in the mountains. Also, I spent a lot of time in the village of the kind that he lives in. So it was actually relatively easy for me to evoke it on the page. But I feel actually, in some sense, all the main characters in the novel, I can see myself in all of them, bits of myself in all of them, including the female protagonist. And I suppose that's what fiction does. It brings you into communication with all these different selves, which you otherwise won't really even acknowledge. I mean, where else would you acknowledge them? Where else would you confront them, if not in the process of imaginative writing?
Right, right. It's almost as though, as fiction writers, we always have alternative lives, all these different alternatives. And can you talk a little bit about how you look at yourself as a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer? You have done, you started as a fiction writer and then quickly, made a name by writing nonfiction. And what do you find in writing fiction that you cannot find in writing nonfiction, and vice versa?
Oh, I think, having returned to fiction writing after 20 years, I feel like I've kind of missed some very crucial things in my nonfiction, which is that it cannot even the autobiographical genre. I feel that even assuming the I, which I'm reluctant to do, but when I do it, even then I find that it's very difficult to be entirely honest about oneself. It's very, very difficult. And in fact, you're one of the few authors where when I read memoirs or autobiographies, there's always a sense that, okay, there's something still being concealed, something still being hidden. And and your books don't give me that impression, but I know that my own writing, I'm still concealing many things. And then, of course, objectively speaking, there are so many experiences, inner lives, doubts, hesitations, that there is really very little you can do with them in nonfiction writing. Again, even the more intimate genres, you can't really do much with them. And so I feel like, having written about India, having written about China, having written about so many different places or societies, and often, writing about the same things, about, people moving massive exodus from the provinces to the big cities, and people drifting into life of crime or drifting into life of corruption. I could just never really go deeper beyond a point. There was ways in which the protocols of nonfiction writing, the boundaries that are very clearly defined, very rigorously policed too, quite rightly. And you had to stay within those boundaries. Whereas with fiction, I just felt there was this enormous freedom to do whatever you wish to. Obviously, you still had to respect certain narrative constraints and certain narrative logics, but still, I mean, the degree of freedom there to explore inner lives really, I thought was extraordinary. So I regret actually not writing more fiction over the last 20 years.
You do. There are so many moments I love in the novel. There are like two moments very close in the book. One is about the narrator's mother, who is, her health is deteriorating. And there's that moment of he's thinking maybe she's going to die. As a reader, as I told you, I was reading on a train to New York. I was just holding my breath and thinking, there was that, almost like I felt relieved that yes, she's going to die. But yet, and then all of a sudden you just sort of jerk yourselves and, well, that's not a good thought. She's such a good character. And then very quickly, there's another moment because the narrator is on a holiday with the girlfriend, Aliyah, and it's not about the sex or the intimacy, it's about her holding his face. She held his face in her hands, and the narrator said all of a sudden he realized nobody has held his face for so many years. Those two moments, when I was reading that part, I thought, well, that you can only do in fiction. I get so close to the character. I know exactly how he feels, even though, I'm not him. But so I find them so touching, and just the just position of the two female characters. I want to just talk a little bit about the mother and the girlfriend who is a fairly westernized Muslim. How do you look at these two female characters? And to me, they are actually quite interconnected in the book. They almost like
Yes, I'm glad you say that, because that was certainly my intention to sort of explore these two possibilities, and both exist obviously in abundant measure in a place like India, where you have a very traditionalist older generation, mothers not particularly well educated, but deeply attached to their families and especially to their sons, and often kind of spending their entire lives in close proximity to their children, if not actually living with them. These are very, very commonplace scenarios also in China. So I wanted to explore this particular relationship with between a son and his mother, which is a relationship of tenderness, of great sweetness and sort of unconditional love, really. But at the same time, it's a confining relationship. It's a relationship that he starts to feel at some point is holding him back from a larger adventure that he hasn't ever enjoyed, which is of companionship, not just sex, but also being with someone else, someone more interesting, someone who's opening up a different kind of world for him. And that is the other possibility, which is of being a woman who's rich, who's extremely well connected, who is very worldly, who's very political, and who's also lonely and melancholy at the same time. So there were these sort of tensions I wanted to bring into play. There's this one, on one hand, you have a woman who really hasn't exercised any choice in her life, who's just been, really kind of not been given any freedoms whatsoever. And she's lived her life within, terrible constraints. And then on the other hand, you have someone who has all the opportunities that wealth, class, education can provide, and yet there is a sense of drift. I think is something that's very central to the way she lives her life and the way she thinks of her position in the world. And this is also something that the narrator observes. So those were the sort of two kind of very divergent ways of being that I wanted to explore, and also connect through the narrator, because what he thinks is missing in one relationship, he hopes to get from another, only to find that the world he's being asked to enter is asking him to renounce too much of his own past, and that he cannot really in the end put up with. But I'm probably giving away too much.
Yeah, yes, it is. It is a book a lot about loss. At what price do you get to where you are, or do you renounce something to be who you are always? And I just want to remind the audience, you can put your question in the Q&A, and Pankaj will answer. I will read the question aloud. And I want to ask literary influence. It's a very literary novel. It opens with Naipaul's quote. Not like on the first page we see Naipaul, and then you turn a page, Chekhov appears, right? And then Turgenev. Those are all writers I really love. Balzac, and I think at some point maybe Dickens also showed up, or maybe I'm imagining. But I want to just hear your thoughts about these, writers before, like who came before us, how they influence your writing and how they influence this novel.
Oh, I think you're right. I mean, I think there are just so many writers, obviously, who go into the making of such a book, because someone writing a novel today in 2022 cannot but be aware of this long, very rich tradition of writing about, essentially whatever theme you choose, you will find it has been anticipated by some writer or other at some point in history. And I think books shaping behavior, or books determining the way you make certain choices in life. I mean, in a way, Madame Bovary is also so led by the books she's reading, the kind of fantasies she has about herself. They're also coming to her from books, and often people object and saying there's too much, sort of metatextuality in a particular novel. But actually, this is the way most people live their lives. We are constantly looking into books for answers, and often taking away answers from our books, often remembering scenes from books. And so I think it was important to bring some of these writers and some of these texts and some of these ideas into play, especially when, the characters, two of the characters or three of the characters are people themselves, both interested in books. One of them is a translator, one of them is actually a novelist, the other is a journalist. So it was, even more crucial, but I think also more importantly, I mean, so many of us are directly inspired by writers, not to, just write books or to think about books in a particular way, but also to take them as life guides, as people who are going to tell you how to live, or give you, certain lines that you can then kind of, pin above your desk and live your life according to that. And the Naipaul line is one of them. For Asim, one of the characters, there's also that Chekhov, the line that he quoted from a letter that Chekhov wrote about, how if you're the grandson of a serf, it takes a long time to squeeze the last blood of the serf out of you, whereas most writers who are born in upper class or aristocratic environs don't have to go through that process. So I think for anyone, and I knew someone who would constantly quote that line, and I thought, obviously he's read something that speaks to him very directly, and has decided to make this, something around which he's going to organize his life or organize his self-perception in many ways. But the writers, Naipaul is definitely one of them, but also Chekhov, one of the writers who is not mentioned in the book, but someone I was thinking of, and you've written very well about him, is William Trevor, who, again, I think the homecoming and leave-taking theme is really strong in his work.
Yes.
And yes, there's so many writers sort of, and there also, I was having fun writing fictions. I was also kind of thinking of scenes which could be kind of almost sort of hidden tributes to writers that I love. Like there's a scene in Venice, which is something that I was kind of reworking the Death in Venice scene, except there are actually Indians present on that beach, which they are actually at any given point whenever you go there these days.
Yes, and there's an episode in the novel I was very touched, because I do feel I share that experiences. They were impoverished. They were poor students. They did not have anything, but they had books. They were reading great literature. There was that genuine joy of seeing the whole world in history, everything, which is exactly right. Which I was thinking, why do I feel so touched by this Indian town in 1980s instead of my New Jersey, highway outside my window, or outside the train window? It is about something that, even in that moment, you can feel the entire world. When you were young, when you were reading great literature, you felt the entire world coming into your mind, your brain. Yeah,
absolutely. That's so right, Yiyun. I mean, I think for many of us, and I can say that, for many people, that kind of spiritual hunger was much, much keener than any other kind of hunger. it was not material deprivation that was, motivating people, but also this great, enormous urge to figure things out. And how are you going to figure things out about your life, about the world, if not through books, if not through literature? And so they were really hugely, hugely important. It's very difficult to convey to my daughter or to, younger people today, just what books meant. And also, one has to remember how rare books were, how difficult it was to find them and to access them. So they, had an even more kind of totemic power over our lives.
Right. I mean, I remember even just getting a piece of newspaper wrapped around a fish. I would
Exactly.
unwrap and read every single word, just that hunger, that desire to see words and to understand the world written in those words.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think we have a few questions from the audience. Let's see the audience questions first. In the process of writing this novel, are there things that you weren't able to include and wish that you could have kept?
In the novel?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think I would have liked to actually, have maybe a couple more characters representing, a little bit more diversity. Maybe a couple more female characters. But again, sometimes you just have to be led by the narrative and the peculiar demands the narrative makes on you. Because if you try and imposing or inserting things, while disobeying the logic of the narrative, you're going to end up with a bloated narrative, and you're going to end up, creating problems for yourself, which you will then spend too much time solving. So I mean, I definitely wanted to. In fact, my original draft had a couple of those characters, and then I had to take them out. I mean, I think just because I didn't want to write a long novel, I can't sustain that. I don't have that sort of stamina. And I really did not want to write anything too longer, more than 350 pages or so.
Right. But I do want to, we haven't got a chance to mention some of the minor characters. One is the narrator's sister. I'm just so moved by this sister who, worked all day long to support, right? To support her family, and so humble. And she gave up her education, the opportunity to education for the brother. And there's a moment when the brother came to see her and gave her the money. And then he said, I know I would never see her again, or I would not return to her. It's heartbreaking, but it's also very true. It feels like people I know, they all have this experience of having someone you deeply love, you owe so much, but then you cannot also be with them. So I find her a very successful character.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I mean, again, I feel like this is something, again, a very common experience. Again, what I was saying earlier about sort of betrayal, that you're not just, moving away from your home, but you're also betraying everything that lived in that home, everyone who lived in that home. And this is very much part of it. Another writer who deals with this theme beautifully, and she writes about America, is Elizabeth Strout. I think that's that sense of, making those enormous journeys and leaving people behind, even though part of you knows that you're, doing something very ruthless, and yet you do it.
Yes. So here's another question. Along your journey of writing, what moment gave you permission to write, to use your voice in this medium?
In fiction or nonfiction?
It didn't say, so maybe you can address both fiction.
Well, that's it's an important question, because I think for many people, who come from relatively modest backgrounds in India, a long time has to pass before you think you're entitled to your experience, and that you're entitled to write about that experience. It takes time to build up courage to share that experience with the wider world, because there are no stages or prescribed stages, like in the US, you go to a creative writing school if you want to write, and you spend 2 or 3 years there honing your skills, and at the end of that period, you will have something to work with, and you'll be connected to agents and publishers and so on. If you're a student in India without access to any of these worlds, you don't really know where to begin and how to begin, and whether it's worth beginning at all. That's also the biggest question really in your mind. So it takes time to gather up courage, and you do it initially very timidly, not telling anyone, kind of hiding from people what you're writing. And at some point, you begin to grow in confidence. But I can't recall any one particular moment because it happened slowly over time.
Right. It sounds that preparations for the leave-taking start at an early age. Yet there's also a strong feeling of betrayal of those left behind once the leave-taking succeeds. How is this tension explored?
Well, this is really what the novelist is about in many ways. That you start preparing early on to get away from everything you've known, and then you spend much of your life, struggling with feelings of betrayal, of this very fraught leave taking that makes it impossible for you to then, to use Yiyun's phrase, to make any kind of emotionally satisfying homecoming. So, in a way, those are I wish it had occurred to me earlier, but those are the two, I suppose, sort of themes around which this novel is structured, really. No, thank you for that. That's a very, really insightful remark that you made, Yiyun, about leave taking and homecoming.
Yeah. What research did you do? I think it's about this book. What research did you do in writing this book? Did you talk to a lot of people who moved away from India as the characters did?
I didn't really set out to do much research. I read a couple of books about Indians in America, especially on Wall Street, and they were useful in just filling in a kind of backdrop. But I had met many of these people in my travels in Europe and America. People in senior positions in Silicon Valley companies or on Wall Street. And it was fascinating talking to them because a few of them would often say, I wish I had a different life. I wish I was an artist, or wish I was a writer. So there were certain possibilities foreclosed for them very early in their lives, and they just chose that particular path. But everything else in the book is something quite familiar to me. That particular world, I grew up in small towns, living very close to railway stations. So that whole world is very, very familiar. And it was interesting to go back very deep into memory to dredge up some of these images and sort of words that were spoken around me at the time. And also I've spent time in a village in the mountains. So that also is a very familiar setting for me. So it was really kind of the more superficial details of the financial world and so on. For that I had to read up a few things.
I do just want to make a comment. I feel very deeply you're just bringing all the memories back, and even by reading, I told you, as earlier I told Pankaj, I started to write about things that I remembered. I didn't even mean to write about those things, but it just moved me to go back to my memory and just capture the sounds and the senses, the smells, and those things. And I find it just very touching.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question for both of you, but I would like to hear your answer. What contemporary novelists do you enjoy reading?
Oh, I'm talking to one of them, but list is long. I mean, I think there are just so many fiction writers that I've learned from. I can think of Alan Hollinghurst. There's the couple of Australian novelists who I rate very highly. Again, who write about themes that I'm very interested in. Michel de Kretser, who I think is a fantastic novelist and one who's written very perceptively about people, taking on different identities in different places, and also the generational conflicts. She's describes them absolutely brilliantly. And there's another Australian novelist called Gail Jones, who I also greatly admire. That's Annie Ernaux, the French memoirist, whose book actually the years made me think, again more deeply about class and what sort of class injuries do to people. And I think in India, it's not just the injuries of class, but it's also caste, and those can be deeply, deeply damaging. And I think her book was really useful in thinking about that. And I've read other books of hers, which have also been incredibly helpful and insightful. There's Jennifer Egan, whose every new novel is something. I read the proof of her latest novel, highly recommended, which is, again, I mean, it's sort of, she's looking ahead to things. She's describing our world before it is our world, and that's again a very rare kind of literary intelligence. So, I feel that Jennifer Egan, and there are other novelists, American novelists, who really are absolutely brilliant at sort of capturing what technology is doing to our souls and to our minds. So you go to novelists looking for different things, and such is the richness of so much contemporary fiction, that you can be very amply satisfied with what you find there.
And just to follow up, another reader said, are there any Indian novelists you admire?
Yes, I think Amit Chaudhary, I think, is a really wonderful novelist. Neil Mukherjee, who has written, I think all his books are absolutely wonderful, incredibly perceptive, and again, he's someone who takes on very complicated issues. Some of the issues we've been talking about this evening. And Anuradha Roy, who's a novelist who should be better known. I think she has a new novel coming out in the US. Arundhati Roy, of course, I think she really opened up a completely new space for many of us, not just in India, but I think internationally. So, I think again, the list is long of writers who are writing at a very high level right now.
Yeah, and I think there's one more question, which actually is the question I also want to ask you to finish the night. So I'm going to read this question and I'll explain to you my question, which is along the way. With the theme of grief and loss, homecoming and leave taking, where can we find ourselves? What do you hope the audience takes away from this story? And that the hope, actually, I was going to ask the question too, because, going back to A Bend in the River, when Naipaul first published the novel, the reviewer in New York Times was so upset and said he didn't even offer a gesture of an imitation of hope to us. So I found that complaint very funny and also fascinating. So, but I do think there's that, where is the hope? I want to, I have my answer after reading your novel, but I want to hear your answer to
I think within the parameters of the novel, it's probably easy to conclude that there is no hope to be drawn from the particular trajectories of these characters. The way they are invested in, they have invested themselves in this, in the accumulation of wealth and fame and sexual experiences and so on and so forth. And I think I include the narrator in this, that he's led probably too sheltered a life, and in the end exposes himself a little bit to the wider world and then again runs away from it. That probably we can't draw much hope from these particular trajectories. But I think hope is such a it's such an incorrigible emotion. As the poet said, it sort of springs eternal. So it's something that in a way is always orienting us towards the future, towards the present, towards other lives. And I feel, I mean, if there was something that I wish the reader were to take away from this book, it would be that that this particular trajectory that these characters are on is probably very likely to lead to disappointment and probably a sense of hopelessness. That hope probably can be found in many of the things we've discarded or thought were not fit for not fit for our new lives. The sense of community, and you see that in our politics today, like people suffering from a lack of community, embracing demagogues, and that this life of individualism or extreme individualism just has too many costs. It leaves too many deep scars and leaves individuals feeling isolated and helpless and hopeless. So in that sense, it's a kind of negative lesson, is that let's not, lead the kind of lives that these people lead, searching for some, elusive satisfaction or contentment, which they can never get, because that contentment is probably available to you right now, right here. But you locate it somewhere far away from you.
That's very good. And I think maybe we're about time. So Sally's coming back.
Yeah. That was such a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you both so much for joining us this evening. And thank you to the audience out there for spending your evening with us. On behalf of Harvard Book Store, Books and Books, Seminary Book Co-op, and Elliott Bay Book Company, keep reading and have a great evening, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you again.